In 1926, a group of men sat in a hotel room and picked a number. They weren't picking a lottery number. They were picking the number that would become the most famous road in American history. And the story they wanted you to remember, the neon signs, the diners, the open road, the freedom, that story is real. But it's not the whole story. Because for every family that drove Route 66 chasing the American dream, there was another family that drove it praying they'd survive the night. For every postcard of a smiling waitress at a roadside diner, there's research identifying 44 counties along that same road where simply being black after dark could put a traveler in real danger. Route 66 turns 100 years old this year, and underneath the nostalgia, the road hides a version of American history most people have never been told. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at that road sign the same way again. Let's start with something almost nobody knows. Route 66 wasn't supposed to be called Route 66 at all. In the mid-1920s, the United States didn't really have a highway system. It had a mess. A patchwork of privately named trails, local roads, and dirt tracks stitched together with no logic at all. So in 1925, the federal government decided to fix it. They'd give the country's major roads numbers instead of names, and the lower the number, the more prestige it carried. The big, straight-line east-west highways were supposed to end in zero. An Oklahoma highway commissioner named Cyrus Avery wanted the crown jewel, a highway running from Chicago all the way to Los Angeles. He wanted it numbered 60. Kentucky said no. Their state highway officials argued that a highway they controlled deserved that route through their state instead, and Washington sided with them. Avery was offered 62 as a consolation prize. He hated it. So on April 30th, 1926, Avery met two other officials in a hotel room in Springfield, Missouri. They went looking for any number that hadn't been claimed yet. They found one, 66. It wasn't a strategic choice. It wasn't symbolic. According to those who've researched the meeting, they simply thought it sounded catchy, and by that afternoon, a telegram was on its way to Washington. That's it. That's the founding myth of America's Main Street. A leftover number, picked because it had a nice rhythm to it. The road was approved that November. But here's the part the postcards leave out. When Route 66 opened, it wasn't even a road yet. Only about a third of its 2,400 miles were paved. The rest was dirt, gravel, sometimes literal wooden planks laid across the ground. It would take 12 more years and thousands of desperate, unemployed men working federal relief programs before Route 66 became the first fully paved highway in the United States. Which brings us to the part of the story that made the road famous in the first place. And it wasn't a road trip. You've probably heard Route 66 called the Mother Road. That nickname didn't come from a tourism board. It came from a novel about human desperation. In 1939, John Steinbeck published The Grapes of Wrath, the story of the Joad family, tenant farmers driven off their land by drought, dust, and debt, forced onto Route 66 in a broken-down truck, chasing the rumor of work in California. Steinbeck wrote that Route 66 was the road of flight, the mother road, the road of flight. The name stuck. It's still what people call it 100 years later. The novel wasn't fiction pulled from nowhere. Between the mid-1930s and 1940, roughly 200,000 people really did leave the Plain States along that highway, hoping California would save them. But here's the layer almost nobody tells you. The myth and the math don't fully line up. Historian James Gregory spent years combing through census and migration records to test the legend against reality. And one detail he uncovered quietly rewrites the whole story. Despite what Steinbeck's title suggests, only a small fraction of the people lumped together as Dust Bowl migrants, by some estimates as few as 6 to 8%, actually came from the literal Dust Bowl, the specific counties hit hardest by the black dust storms. Most of the rest were fleeing something less cinematic, but just as brutal. Collapsing cotton prices, crushing debt, and a farming economy that had been failing long before the dust ever started blowing. In other words, the image everyone remembers, a black cloud on the horizon, a family fleeing a wall of dust, wasn't really what drove most of Route 66's most famous travelers onto the road. It was money. It was always money. So the mother road Steinbeck immortalized wasn't quite the road everyone assumes it was. Even the people telling this story at the time were, in a way, telling the wrong disaster. And even that version of the story, money trouble, not dust storms, was still a story about people who had a choice about where to sleep at night. Not everyone did. Route 66 crossed 89 counties on its way from Chicago to Santa Monica. Cultural historian Candace Taylor spent years researching the highway's segregation history for her book on black travel in America. Her count, 44 of those 89 counties, essentially half, were what were known at the time as sundown towns, places where black residents and travelers were, unofficially but very effectively, expected to be gone before the sun went down. Not always by written law, by something more dangerous, an unwritten rule enforced by whoever happened to be watching. Sociologist James Lowen, who spent years cataloging these towns nationwide, called them all white on purpose. Some historical accounts from the era describe a quiet, coded system some segregated businesses used to signal who they would and wouldn't serve. A kind of shorthand that locals understood and outsiders had to learn the hard way. Word of mouth did the rest of the work. For a black family driving Route 66 in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, get your kicks wasn't the point. Survival planning was. Picture it. A family car, packed tighter than it should be, not just with suitcases, but with water jugs, extra sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, blankets folded in the back seat. Not for comfort, because nobody knows yet if there will be a motel tonight that will rent them a room, or a diner that will let them sit down. The father checks the fuel gauge more often than he needs to, because running out of gas in the wrong county after dark isn't an inconvenience. It's a risk. This wasn't one family's story. Historians say it was a routine repeated by thousands of black travelers, county after county, all the way down Route 66. According to Taylor, the exhaustion this caused was serious enough that the NAACP, at the time, pointed to it as a factor behind a troubling number of crashes. Drivers pushing through the night rather than stopping somewhere that might turn them away, or worse. In 1936, a postal worker from Harlem named Victor Hugo Green tried to fix that. He published a guidebook, the Negro Motorist Green Book, listing the hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and even private homes across the country where black travelers could stop without fear. Along Route 66 alone, it became something close to a survival manual, passed from household to household for over 30 years. And nowhere does this hidden history land harder than in one Oklahoma city that sits almost directly on the route. Tulsa, Oklahoma calls itself the capital of Route 66, and just off that highway once stood the Greenwood district, a neighborhood so prosperous, so self-sufficient, it earned the nickname Black Wall Street. In 1921, that neighborhood was destroyed. Mobs of white residents, some reportedly deputized on the spot, burned Greenwood to the ground in what's now remembered as the Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the deadliest acts of racial violence in American history. Route 66 wouldn't even exist as a numbered highway for another 5 years. And yet by 1939, less than 2 decades after Greenwood was reduced to ash, the community had rebuilt itself well enough to appear in the Green Book, listing hotels, restaurants, beauty parlors, and gas stations that welcomed black travelers passing through on America's new Main Street. That resilience is remarkable. But there's a bitter twist to how this story circles back. Decades later, when America built its next generation of highways, the interstates that would eventually make Route 66 obsolete, one of them, Interstate 244, was constructed directly over what had once been Greenwood Avenue, splitting the rebuilt community in two all over again. The road that symbolized freedom for so many Americans helped pave over the same neighborhood that had already survived one attempt to erase it. By the 1950s, the government was already building Route 66's replacement. The 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act funded a new generation of interstates, wider, faster, and designed to bypass small towns entirely instead of running straight through their downtowns the way Route 66 always had. It's worth noting, it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the federal enforcement that followed that the motels, diners, and gas stations along Route 66 were legally required to serve everyone, regardless of race. In other words, by the time Route 66 finally became a road where every American could stop safely, the road was already dying. Some historians argue the bigger corporate motel chains and gas stations along the new interstates had a built-in incentive to openly welcome all travelers. Doing so helped shield them from the legal scrutiny that followed the Civil Rights Act, in a way the old mom-and-pop businesses along Route 66 never really had to think about. Whether or not that was the deciding factor, the effect was the same. Traffic drained away. Small towns that had survived on travelers stopping for gas and a meal watched the cars simply stop coming. On June 27, 1985, U.S. Route 66 was formally removed from the United States highway system. The Main Street of America was erased from the map, decades after the interstate had already erased it from people's routines. Here's the strange part. The road disappeared. The legend didn't. In 1946, just 6 years after John Ford's film adaptation of The Grapes of Wrath had burned that highway sign into the American imagination, Nat King Cole released "Get Your Kicks on Route 66," a song later covered by Chuck Berry and the Rolling Stones. By the 1960s, a television drama simply called Route 66 turned the highway into a symbol of restless youth and self-discovery. Decades later, Pixar's Cars would tell the story of a town left behind by the interstate, a fictional retelling of the very real decline of towns along the actual road. Somewhere between the song, the film, and the television series, the highway stopped being a piece of asphalt and became something closer to a national origin myth. Proof, supposedly, that America was a place where you could always just get in a car and start over. For some people, it really was that. For others, that same stretch of asphalt was a minefield they had to navigate just to get a meal or a place to sleep. This year, that number, 66, turns 100 years old. 8 states are holding festivals, relighting decades-old neon signs, restoring ghost town gas stations where wild burros, descendants of old mining animals, still wander the streets. Families are driving the old road from Chicago to Santa Monica the same way the Jodes once did, except now it's nostalgia instead of desperation. And that's not wrong to celebrate. The road really did connect a country. It really did carry hope alongside the hardship. But 100 years is also long enough to finally tell the whole story. Not just the one about the open road and the neon lights, but the one about who got to enjoy that freedom, who had to survive it, and what still sits quietly underneath the pavement. Because the real history of Route 66 was never just about a road. It was about who America let travel it in peace, and who had to fight for every single mile.
If this is the version of Route 66 you were never taught, subscribe. This channel exists to tell the parts of American history the postcards leave out.